My grandfather knew where a lost civilization was buried, and he took that secret to his grave on purpose. I found out by accident. He passed away 2 springs ago, left me a storage unit full of old equipment, survey maps, and 3 cardboard boxes sealed with the kind of tape that turns yellow and brittle after decades. I almost threw all of it out. I had a truck booked. I was ready to clear the whole unit in an afternoon, and then I cut open the wrong box first. Inside was a stack of photographs, black and white, printed on thick paper the way they used to do it, edges slightly curled. Most of them were landscape shots, empty terrain, survey markers, the kind of thing you'd expect from a man who spent 30 years doing geological work across North Africa. I was flipping through them fast, not really looking, and then I stopped. One photograph was different from the others. It showed a corridor, not a natural rock formation, not a shadow playing tricks in the desert light. A corridor. 2 walls running parallel, maybe 15 feet apart, built from stone blocks that were cut and fitted together with a precision that looked almost uncomfortable, like whoever did it was making a point. The walls disappeared into the sand at both ends, swallowed by a dune on the left side and what looked like a collapsed section on the right, but the middle portion was still standing, still clean, still sharp at the corners in a way that stone doesn't stay sharp after erosion works on it for a normal amount of time. On the back of the photograph, in my grandfather's handwriting, was a set of coordinates and 2 words. Nothing else. Just 2 words. Don't ask. I stood in that storage unit for a long time with that photograph in my hand. And I want to be honest with you, my first feeling wasn't excitement or curiosity. It was something closer to the feeling you get when you realize mid-conversation that someone has been lying to you for years and you only just now noticed. A kind of slow, cold settling in the chest. Because here's the thing. My grandfather wasn't a dramatic man. He wasn't the type to write cryptic notes or leave mysteries behind for people to find. He was precise, methodical, the kind of person who labeled everything and filed everything and never left a loose end. 2 words on the back of a photograph wasn't his style, which meant those 2 words cost him something to write. I took the box home. I spread everything out on my kitchen table, and I went through it piece by piece over 3 evenings. The survey maps were standard issue, the kind his company would have filed copies of. The equipment logs were thorough and boring, but tucked at the very bottom of the 3rd box, folded inside a canvas document sleeve, was a copy of the official survey report for the region where that photograph was taken. I read through it twice. Then I looked at the photograph again. Then I read the report a 3rd time, slower. The corridor wasn't in it. Not mentioned, not flagged, not logged as an anomaly. The coordinates on the back of the photograph fell inside a section of the report marked as surveyed and clear. According to the official record, nothing was there. No structures, no formations of note, nothing worth a second look. My grandfather had been on that survey crew. His name was in the report as one of the field team members. He had stood in front of those walls, taken a photograph, written the coordinates in his own hand, and then signed off on a report that pretended none of it existed. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept coming back to the same question, not what is that corridor, not how old is it, but something simpler and somehow more disturbing. Why did he keep the photograph at all? If you want something buried, you bury everything. You don't seal one photograph in a box and write, "Don't ask" on the back of it, and leave it for your grandson to find 30 years later. That's not hiding something. That's hiding something while making sure it can still be found. And the difference between those 2 things is everything. If you're finding this story as gripping as I am, subscribe and hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep going. And what comes next is the part that changes everything. The next morning, I started looking for the survey company's original filed records, the ones that would have gone to whatever government office oversaw that kind of work in that region at that time. It took me 4 days of making calls and sending messages that mostly went unanswered. When I finally got a response, it came from a researcher at a small documentation archive who told me something that made the hair on my arm stand up. The survey company had filed their reports with a specific regional office, standard procedure. That office had been restructured and formally closed some years later. Its files were transferred to a central holdings facility. The researcher had checked. The transfer records existed. The files were listed. But the specific batch covering my grandfather's survey period had been redirected before the transfer, logged out to a separate review process, and never logged back in. Not destroyed, redirected. There is a significant difference. Destroyed means someone wanted it gone. Redirected means someone wanted it somewhere specific, somewhere controlled, somewhere they could decide later what to do with it. The files weren't missing. They were kept, just not somewhere anyone without a reason to look would ever find them. I printed out the transfer records the researcher sent me and laid them next to the photograph on my kitchen table. The corridor with the precise stone joints and the joints that didn't weather right, and the coordinates my grandfather wrote in careful handwriting and then told me not to ask about. And on the other side, a paper trail that stopped exactly where it should have continued, stopped cleanly, stopped in a way that looked from a distance like normal bureaucratic procedure and only looked like something else when you got close enough to notice the seam. Here is what I kept coming back to. The official story about the Deep Sahara is simple. It dried out, people left, the desert became empty, nothing was ever built there worth discussing. That story gets repeated in classrooms and documentaries and reference books without anyone pushing on it because it sounds complete. It has a beginning and a middle and an end, and things with a clean ending don't invite questions. But a report that's been redirected isn't a clean ending. It's a door left unlocked by someone who couldn't bring themselves to lock it all the way. My grandfather photographed something real, filed paperwork that hid it, kept one photograph sealed in a box for decades, and wrote 2 words on the back that he knew I would eventually read. He wasn't trying to bury the truth. He was trying to protect it until someone was ready to carry it further than he was willing to go. I was starting to think that someone might be me. And I was starting to understand that the corridor in the photograph wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was a doorway into something much, much larger. Emily told me she had found over 1,000 structures that weren't supposed to exist, and that 3 separate academic institutions had told her to stop looking. I found her through a comment thread on a forum where someone had posted a blurry screenshot of satellite imagery with a question nobody could answer. The image showed something that looked like a perfectly straight line cutting across open desert for what the scale bar suggested was a very long distance. Most people in the thread were dismissing it, throwing out the usual explanations, erosion patterns, old caravan trails, camera artifacts. One person wasn't dismissing it. She had replied with 4 sentences that were so precise and so loaded with specific technical language that they stopped me cold. I sent her a message that same night. Her name was Emily, and she worked out of a small home office that she described to me in our first video call as a room that had completely defeated her attempts to keep it organized. Behind her, I could see 3 monitors, 2 of them showing the same pale tan expanse of desert from different zoom levels, and walls covered in printed satellite images pinned side by side with colored markers connecting points between them. She looked like someone who had been deep inside a problem for so long that the problem had started to redecorate around her. I told her about the photograph. I told her about the survey report and the redirected files. She listened without interrupting, which I noticed because most people interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she turned to one of her side monitors and typed something and said, "Give me the coordinates from the back of the photograph." I read them out. She typed them in. And then she just stared at her screen for a few seconds without saying anything, and I watched her expression do something complicated. The coordinates sat at the center of the largest grid cluster she had in her entire dataset. She had been mapping that cluster for over 2 years without knowing what was at its middle point because the center area had persistent cloud and haze coverage in most of the available imagery passes. My grandfather's photograph had just given her the anchor point she had been working around without ever being able to pin down. What Emily had built over those 2 years was something that took my breath away when she finally shared her full screen with me. Across a vast stretch of the Central Sahara, she had documented a pattern of lines and shapes that covered an area I can only describe as continental in scale. Not dozens of sites, not hundreds. Over 1,000 individual features, all cataloged, all cross-referenced, all showing the same basic geometric logic. Evenly spaced parallel lines intersecting at clean angles, circular enclosures of consistent diameter positioned at regular intervals along the main grid axes, and radiating outward from several of the largest enclosures, lines that moved across the terrain like the spokes of a wheel, connecting point to point across distances that would have taken weeks to walk. Riverbeds don't do that. Wind erosion doesn't do that. Nothing that forms without intention does that. Emily had run the geometry through 3 different analysis tools, and the result was the same every time. The spacing was deliberate. The angles were deliberate. Whatever made those lines was working from a plan. She had submitted her findings to 3 institutions. The first had responded that her methodology needed peer review before the data could be taken seriously. The second had not responded at all. The third had responded warmly, expressed interest, asked for her full data set, and then gone completely silent. That was 14 months before we spoke. She had never heard back. The data set she sent them was never cited, never referenced, never returned. One of the grid's main radial lines ran directly toward a zone that was listed in current regional survey databases as restricted access. No research permits issued, no explanation given for the restriction beyond a category code that translated roughly as administrative hold. The restriction had been in place for a long time. Emily had tried twice to find out who had placed it. Both times the inquiry had dead-ended at a departmental reference number that pointed to an office that no longer existed. The corridor in my grandfather's photograph was sitting at the center of something that had been deliberately mapped out across the desert on a scale that made my head hurt to look at. And the one part of that map that nobody was allowed to approach was exactly the part that the radial lines all pointed toward. I asked Emily if she had any idea what was in that restricted zone. She pulled up a different screen, one with older imagery, lower resolution, the kind of satellite pass that came from early survey programs before the optics got sharp. She zoomed in slowly. Even through the grain and the haze you could see it. Shapes. Geometry. Something that sat in the landscape the way a city sits, not like a natural feature, not like terrain, but like something that had been placed there by something that knew what it was doing. Whatever was in that zone, someone had decided a long time ago that the rest of the world wasn't ready to look at it. I stared at that low-resolution image on my screen for a long time. The shapes were indistinct, but the intention behind them wasn't. And sitting there in my kitchen, with Emily's voice quiet on the other end of the call, I felt something shift in the way I understood the whole picture. This wasn't one hidden corridor in one photograph. This was a system, and systems don't appear from nowhere. They get built by someone for a reason at a scale that takes generations. Which meant the next question wasn't, "What is this?" The next question was, "How old is it?" And the answer to that question was the one that everything else had been built to keep buried. It turned out that answer had already been found multiple times, and every single time it had been made to disappear. The pattern I'm about to describe took me weeks to piece together, and when I finally saw the full shape of it, I sat back in my chair and just laughed because there was nothing else to do with that feeling, not because it was funny, because it was so consistent, so clean, so perfectly repeated across decades in different countries and different research teams that it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like policy. Across the geological and archaeological survey record for the Deep Sahara, Going back through colonial-era fieldwork all the way to more recent independent studies, there is a recurring event. A team goes into the field. They find something that doesn't fit. They run the numbers. The numbers come back wrong, meaning too old, meaning old in a way that puts the structure or the artifact or the channel outside every accepted framework for human activity in that region. The team publishes. The publication gets challenged. The challenge doesn't disprove the finding. It just questions the methodology, raises the possibility of contamination, suggests the dating technique may have been applied incorrectly. And then, quietly, the site gets removed from the active research list. Not closed with a definitive counterfinding, just removed, set aside, filed under further study required, which in practice means never touched again. I found at least 7 separate instances of this sequence across the material I gathered with Emily's help. 7 different teams, different decades, different parts of the Saharan interior, all finding the same basic thing. Constructed features, engineered channels, or worked stone surfaces returning age estimates that placed them before any civilization was supposed to be operating in that region. And in every single case, the response was not investigation. It was administrative disappearance. One case hit me harder than the others. A small geological team working on a water mapping project in the western interior had sampled organic material sealed inside a dry underground channel. Not a cave, not a natural formation. A channel with a uniform cross-section, a consistent gradient, and junction points where 2 channels met at a controlled angle designed to manage water flow. The kind of thing that gets built by engineers, not formed by water moving through rock over time. The organic material came back extremely old, far older than the cultures credited in any textbook with building water infrastructure in that region. The lead researcher filed a report, a follow-up survey was approved, and then the approval was rescinded 3 weeks later, no reason given, and the researcher was reassigned to a different project in a different country before the season was out. Emily found the follow-up correspondence in a digitized colonial archive that hadn't been properly indexed, meaning it had been scanned and uploaded but never tagged in a way that made it searchable. You could only find it if you were already looking at the surrounding documents and happened to notice the file reference. It read like a normal administrative letter, polite and procedural, but what it was doing was ending an investigation that had just found something important, quickly and cleanly, without leaving a visible reason why. The channels that team had been studying, Emily had those in her data set. They were part of the same network her grid lines connected. And when she modeled the full extent of the channel system based on the fragments that had been surveyed across different studies over the years, the scale of what emerged was staggering. This wasn't a local irrigation system. This was a continental water management network with distribution nodes and gradient-controlled flow and junction engineering that implied a level of planning that didn't fit anywhere in the accepted history of the region. But the detail that stopped me completely was something Emily had noticed and sat on for months because she hadn't known how to frame it. The channels in the deepest, oldest-looking sections of the network ran beneath terrain that had been buried under sand for an extremely long time. Not recently buried in a way that matched the timeline of the Sahara's desertification, the period when the green savanna dried out and the sand came in, which meant those channels were dug before the desert existed, before the sand, before the region became the wasteland the textbooks describe. Whoever built that water network wasn't managing a desert. They were managing a living landscape, a populated one that needed water delivered at scale across enormous distances because there were people and cities at the other end waiting to receive it. There is a shape in the Western Sahara that ancient texts described in precise detail thousands of years before any satellite ever looked down and confirmed it was there. Emily had been avoiding showing it to me. She told me that directly, in almost those exact words, when she finally pulled it up on her screen during our 4th call together. She said she had been sitting on it for months because she knew how it would sound, and she didn't want the whole investigation to get dismissed because of one comparison that was too easy to ridicule. I told her to show me anyway. What came up on my screen was a satellite image of a circular formation in the western part of the Sahara. 3 rings, one inside the other, the outermost one spanning a distance that, according to the scale bar, stretched wider than most cities I had ever lived near. The rings were formed from different rock layers, each one a slightly different tone in the image, pale tan and dusty brown, and a deeper reddish layer underneath, where erosion had cut down to older material. From above, it looked like a target drawn in the landscape by something that had access to a very large pen. The formation had an official geological explanation: volcanic uplift, deep erosion over an enormous span of time, the kind of process that takes longer than the human mind can really hold. And maybe that explanation is correct. I am not a geologist, and I am not going to stand here and tell you the science is wrong. But Emily wasn't asking me to throw out the geology. She was asking me to look at something else. She pulled up a text on a second window, an ancient description of a great city, written down long before modern archaeology existed, long before anyone was measuring things from orbit. The description was specific: concentric rings, a western position at the edge of the known world, mountains behind it, a long channel connection running toward open ocean, and a catastrophic end, a sudden overwhelming flood followed by the land going dry and silent. Emily had overlaid the text description onto the satellite image point by point. The rings matched, the position matched. The mountains existed, running along the correct bearing behind the formation, and the channels, the long dry cuts in the terrain that ran westward from the outer ring toward the Atlantic coast, were visible in the imagery as clearly as roads on a map. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I am not telling you this formation is definitely what that ancient text describes. What I am telling you is that Emily had gone through the match methodically, detail by detail, and she could not find a single point where the description failed to correspond to the physical reality. Not one. And at the far western end of those dry channel lines, where they finally flattened out toward the old coastline, the imagery showed something else. A second feature, smaller, less dramatic, sitting right at the point where the channels terminated. It was irregular enough that you could explain it away as a natural formation if you wanted to. But it sat in the landscape the way a harbor sits, like something designed to be the receiving end of a long delivery system. Emily had flagged it in her dataset 18 months earlier. She had labeled it simply as secondary node, western terminus. She had never told anyone else it was there. And when I asked her why, she said something I have thought about many times since. She said she was waiting until she had something to put next to it that made it impossible to ignore. She thought she was close. And I was starting to think she was right. The ancient world ran on bronze, and someone in the deep Sahara was supplying the metal that made that possible, and nobody in mainstream history will tell you that. That is not a dramatic overstatement. It is a conclusion that falls out of the material evidence when you follow it without deciding in advance where it's allowed to lead. I started looking into it because of something Emily mentioned almost as a side note near the end of one of our calls. She said that one of the radial lines in her grid ran toward a region that old colonial mining surveys had flagged as containing unusual mineral concentrations, including tin deposits that had never been properly assessed because the region was considered too remote for commercial interest. Tin. That one word sent me down a path that took 3 weeks and completely changed how I understood everything we had been looking at. The ancient world needed bronze. Bronze needs copper and tin mixed together. Copper was relatively available around the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Tin was not. The tin problem has been a genuine puzzle for historians for a long time because the bronze that built the ancient world, the bronze in the weapons and the tools and the ceremonial objects of Greece and Mesopotamia and dynastic Egypt, contains trace chemical signatures that point to source material, And when researchers have actually followed those signatures, the results have consistently been uncomfortable. Some of the tin came from known sources in Europe and Asia, but a portion of it, a significant portion that shows up across multiple ancient cultures and multiple centuries, carries an isotopic profile that matches deposits in the African interior, deep interior, Saharan interior, the kind of location that, in the accepted timeline, no ancient trading network was supposed to reach. Except that Emily had a map of an ancient trading network that reached exactly there. The grid lines, the radial roads, the water channels that kept a population alive across enormous distances. That infrastructure wasn't built for scenery. It was built to move things, people, water, goods, raw materials. And if the raw materials included the tin that the entire ancient world needed to function, then the picture that emerges is not a minor revision to history. It is a complete inversion of it. The Mediterranean wasn't the engine of the ancient world. It was the loading dock. The engine was in the interior, in the Sahara, in a network of cities and roads and water systems that nobody is supposed to know existed. Egypt wasn't a source civilization. It was a distribution point sitting on the northern edge of a much larger operation. And when that operation stopped, when whatever ended it finally ended it, the whole ancient world went into a collapse that historians have been puzzling over ever since. A Bronze Age unraveling that hit multiple major civilizations at almost exactly the same time, with no single cause that anyone has been able to point to definitively. Emily had pulled the timeline of that collapse and laid it against her estimated timeline for when the Saharan infrastructure went silent, based on the geological and survey data we had been accumulating. The overlap wasn't approximate. It was exact. The trunk lines went down, and within a generation, the civilizations at the delivery end started falling apart, one after another, like buildings that had just had their foundations pulled out. I remember sitting with that comparison on my screen and feeling something that I can only describe as the vertigo you get when a floor you thought was solid turns out to be suspended over something much deeper than you realized. Everything I thought I understood about why the ancient world rose and fell had just been reframed in about 40 minutes of looking at a map. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, sitting at the center of Emily's grid, was a restricted zone that nobody was allowed to enter. A zone that the radial lines all pointed toward. A zone that the tin roots ran through. A zone that the ancient channels fed into. Something was in there. And I was becoming increasingly certain that whatever it was the piece that made everything else make sense. I just had no idea yet what it would cost to find out. There is a field of glass sitting in the eastern Sahara, the size of a small country, and the official explanation for how it got there has a hole in it large enough to drive a truck through. I had known about the glass deposits in a vague way before all of this started. Most people who read about the ancient world have come across a reference to them at some point, usually in the context of a famous artifact, a carved gemstone of pale yellow-green glass found in a burial treasure belonging to an Egyptian ruler, one of the most analyzed objects in all of Egyptology. The glass it was cut from came from the desert. Everyone agrees on that. The disagreement is about the rest of it. The official position is that the glass is extraordinarily old, formed by a meteor event in the deep geological past, and that the people who carved that gemstone simply picked up a piece of it off the surface the way you might pick up an interesting rock on a beach. That explanation works if you don't look at it too hard. But Emily had started looking at it hard, and she had found something that neither of us could explain away. She had been cross-referencing the glass deposit locations against her grid map, initially just out of habit, overlaying every geological dataset she could find onto her base layer to see if anything lined up. And something lined up. The densest concentrations of surface glass, the areas where the deposits were thickest and most continuous, sat directly on top of two of the main radial lines in her grid, not near them, not in the general vicinity, directly on top with an overlap precise enough that it made her recheck the coordinate alignment 3 times before she mentioned it to me. That overlap could mean nothing. Geological features and ancient infrastructure lines crossing each other is not automatically significant. But then Emily pulled a second layer, the stratigraphic data from the few geological surveys that had sampled the glass field in detail, and the picture got harder to dismiss. The glass in the densest zones sat at a depth in the soil profile that placed its formation event much more recently than the official estimate, not millions of years ago. Much, much more recently. Recent enough to overlap with the period when the Saharan civilization would have been at its height and then stopped. Whatever produced those temperatures high enough to turn sand into glass across an area that stretched further than I could hold in my head as a single image, it didn't happen in the quiet geological past. It happened when people were there. And it happened fast, not erosion, not slow volcanic activity, not anything that gives you time to adjust or move or prepare. Something came through that region with enormous, sudden, ferocious heat, and the sand remembers it in the only way sand can, by having turned into something else entirely. I asked Emily what could do that. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said there were a few candidate explanations, none of them comfortable. A large airburst event, the kind where a space rock doesn't reach the ground but detonates in the atmosphere and releases its energy downward in a concentrated column of heat, a cluster of such events across a wide area. Or something that the geology papers she had read never proposed directly, but that the distribution pattern of the deposits kept suggesting to her, something that moved along the surface rather than falling from above, something that followed the terrain. Followed, she said, almost like it was using the same corridors the grid was built around. She said she didn't know what that something would be. She said she wasn't ready to name it. But the glass was there. The grid was there. The overlap was real, and the timing put both of them in the same window. Whatever ended, the Saharan civilization may have left its signature burned directly into the landscape. And the landscape had been holding that signature ever since, in plain sight, while the official story talked about meteor events from a time before humans existed and hoped nobody looked too closely at the depth measurements. I had been building a picture piece by piece for months, my grandfather's photograph, Emily's grid, the suppressed dating results, the tin roots, the channels that predated the desert itself, and now the glass. Each piece on its own could be challenged, explained, set aside. But together they were forming something that I could no longer look at without feeling the full weight of what it implied. I just hadn't yet found the human face of it, the evidence that real people, in recent history, had known about all of this and made active decisions about what to do with that knowledge. That was about to change. The thing about archives is that they are only as complete as the person who organized them wanted them to be, and the colonial-era survey records that Emily and I had been working through were organized by people who had strong opinions about what was worth keeping. Most of what survived was administrative, budgets, staffing rosters, equipment logs, the kind of paperwork that bureaucracies generate automatically and file without thinking. The substantive field reports, the ones that contained actual observations and measurements, and the kind of specific detail that makes a document dangerous, those had been much more selectively preserved. You could see the shape of what was missing by the gaps in the reference numbers, sequences that jumped forward by dozens of entries with nothing in between, like pages torn from a book with enough care that the binding still held. But people are imperfect, and one imperfection kept saving us. Field researchers in that era often kept personal copies of their notes, not official documents, just handwritten journals, the kind of thing a person carries in a coat pocket and fills in at the end of a long day in the field when the light is going and the temperature is dropping and you want to get something down before you lose the detail. Those journals were personal property, They didn't get filed, they didn't get redirected, they didn't disappear into administrative holding systems. They went home with the people who wrote them. And sometimes, decades later, they ended up in boxes in storage units or donated to small local archives that nobody thought to sanitize, or passed down through families who had no idea what they were holding. Emily had developed a network over her years of independent research, a loose group of people around the world who shared her habit of looking in the places that the official record forgot to cover. One of those people was a woman named Sarah, who worked as a cataloger for a small private document collection that had absorbed the estate papers of several colonial-era surveyors and engineers decades ago. Sarah had been working through the collection slowly, item by item, and she had flagged something for Emily almost a year before I came into the picture. Emily had noted it and not yet followed up. When she finally went back to it and pulled the file reference, she called me within the hour. It was a personal journal, written by a field engineer who had worked in the Saharan interior across multiple survey seasons. The journal covered several years of work, written in close, careful handwriting on paper that had gone the color of old tea. Sarah had transcribed the early sections, and they were routine, camp logistics, equipment problems, notes on terrain and weather. But the final entries were different. The handwriting changed, became less careful, more compressed, like someone writing quickly or writing under a kind of pressure. And what those final entries described was not routine at all. The engineer had found something, not a corridor, not a channel, not a surface scatter of worked stone, something larger, something that he described in terms that kept circling around the same inadequacy, like a man trying to describe a color he had never seen before and only had familiar words to reach for. He wrote about walls that ran further than he could walk in a day. He wrote about chambers cut into bedrock with a precision that made his professional instincts go quiet with something he called respect and something else he couldn't name. He wrote about alignment, about how the structures he was looking at seemed to be oriented not randomly, but deliberately, toward specific points on the horizon, toward the position of certain stars at certain times of year, and then he wrote about what he had been told to do with what he found. He had been told in a direct communication from the senior administrative officer overseeing the survey program to complete his documentation privately, to exclude his findings from the official field report, and to surrender his personal notes along with all physical samples at the end of the season. The journal entry describing this instruction had a quality to it that I recognized from my grandfather's photograph. It was the quality of a person recording something they couldn't fully process, writing it down because the act of writing it made it more real, and more real was the only thing that felt like resistance. The journal was incomplete. The final pages were missing, not torn out, just absent. The notebook ending mid-season with no closing entry. But what remained was enough, because the engineer had done something that the instruction had apparently not anticipated. Before surrendering his documentation, he had written down the coordinates of the main site in 3 separate entries, embedded in what looked like routine terrain notes disguised as elevation references. It took Emily 2 hours to decode them. When she plotted them on her map, she put her hand over her mouth and didn't say anything for almost a minute. The coordinates sat inside the restricted zone, right at its center, and they matched, within a margin that GPS accuracy couldn't entirely account for, the shapes she had been seeing in the old low-resolution satellite imagery, the ones that looked like a city seen through fog. Someone had been to that place. Someone had documented it carefully and thoroughly, and someone else had made sure that documentation never reached the public record. The journal had survived by accident through the ordinary human failure of forgetting to collect one notebook from one coat pocket at the end of one field season, and it had been sitting in a cataloging backlog for decades, waiting for someone to look at it. The engineer's name was listed in the estate records. I looked him up. He had been reassigned at the end of that survey season, moved to administrative work in a different region, and never returned to field survey work again. He had retired quietly some years later and left no published work of any kind. The most precise structures ever built in the ancient world were not the newest ones. They were the oldest. And that single fact breaks the entire story we have been told about human progress. I had been sitting with the engineer's journal coordinates for 3 days when this hit me. Emily and I had been so focused on the restricted zone, on what was inside it, on the administrative trail that led to it, that neither of us had stepped back far enough to look at the wider pattern that the journal itself was pointing toward. The engineer had written about precision. He had used that word repeatedly in his entries, almost obsessively, the way a person uses a word when they can't find a better one and keep hoping the repetition will carry the weight they need it to carry. Precision of cut, precision of fit, precision of alignment. And then he had written something in one of the later entries that I had read quickly the first time and only properly absorbed on the third pass. He wrote that the structures he was documenting did not look like the work of a civilization learning how to build. They looked like the work of a civilization that had already forgotten most of what it once knew and was doing its best with what remained. I read that sentence out loud to Emily on our next call. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she had been thinking about the same thing from a different angle. She had been running measurements on every ancient construction site in her dataset that had publicly available survey data, comparing the technical precision of the stonework across different time periods, and the pattern was not what progress would predict. The oldest layers were the tightest. The oldest surfaces had tolerances that should not have been achievable with the tools the accepted timeline assigned to that period, joints that fit without binding, angles that held their geometry across long spans, alignments to astronomical positions that required not just knowledge of the sky, but generations of careful observation and recording. And then, as you moved forward in time, as the cultures of Egypt and the Levant developed and grew and built more and more, the precision degraded, slowly at first, then faster. By the time you reach the period that most textbooks describe as the height of ancient achievement, the work was visibly rougher than what had come before. The buildings were larger in some cases, more decorated, more impressive at first glance, but under the decoration, the underlying craft was coarser. The angles were less true. The fits were packed with filler material to compensate for surfaces that didn't quite meet. It was the difference between a master's original work and a student's careful copy, and then a copy of that copy, each generation reproducing the visible form while losing a little more of the underlying understanding that made the form possible. This is what inheritance looks like when the source goes silent. You keep building because building is what you know you're supposed to do. You keep using the forms because the forms carry authority and meaning. But the deep knowledge, the part that lived in the hands and the minds of the people who developed it over centuries, that part doesn't transfer through instruction alone. It transfers through practice and through the living chain of person-to-person transmission. Break the chain and the copies start to drift. The buildings keep going up, but something in them is slowly going wrong, and after enough generations, the people doing the building don't even know what they've lost because they never had it to begin with. The civilization that the engineer had documented in that restricted zone, the one that Emily's grid mapped at continental scale, the one that the water channels served and the tin roots fed and the radial roads connected across thousands of miles of what is now empty desert, that civilization was the source. Everything we have been taught to call ancient and impressive was built downstream from it by people working from memory, doing their best to replicate something they had inherited but never fully understood. And every generation they got a little further from the original, a little less precise, a little more dependent on volume and decoration to compensate for what the craft had lost. The peak was not ahead of them. It was behind them. It had always been behind them, and it was buried under the sand. 3 weeks after Emily decoded the coordinates from the engineer's journal, the restricted zone designation on that area quietly lapsed. There was no announcement. No press release, No academic notice, no official acknowledgement that anything had changed. Emily found it by accident, the way she found most things, by running a routine check on access classifications for regions in her dataset and noticing that a category code had been updated. The administrative hold that had been in place for decades was gone, replaced with a standard unclassified survey designation that meant, in practice, that someone could now apply for research access and expect a normal response. I don't know why it changed. I have thought about that question a lot, and I still don't have a clean answer. Maybe it was administrative, a periodic review that nobody had gotten around to before. Maybe the people who had originally placed the restriction were simply no longer in positions where they could maintain it. Maybe something else happened that I don't have visibility into. What I know is that the timing felt significant in a way that was hard to set aside. Emily and I had been pulling on threads for months. Sarah had flagged the engineer's journal. The coordinates were now decoded and documented. The pattern we had assembled was no longer just ours. We had been sharing pieces of it with a small group of independent researchers, carefully, without publishing anything formal, building toward a point where the documentation was solid enough to put forward publicly. And then the zone opened. Emily filed for survey access within a week. The application went through a standard processing channel and came back approved, conditionally, pending a review of proposed methodology. Normal language, professional, procedural, the kind of response that suggests nobody on the other end was alarmed by the request. She started putting together a small field team. I am not going to name them here because the work is ongoing, and the last thing any of us needs is that kind of attention before the findings are documented properly. But I want to tell you what happened 2 weeks before the team was due to go out, because this is the part that made everything real in a way that all the satellite imagery and archive documents and decoded journal entries hadn't quite managed. A message came through Emily's research contact network. It was from a family living on the edge of the region, people who had been working that terrain for generations, who knew every dune and every rock shelf and every place where the wind behaved in ways that told you something about what was underneath. They had been watching a particular section of the landscape for years, a low area where the dune patterns suggested a large buried feature, the kind of geometry that experienced eyes learn to read the way a doctor reads a scan. That season, the dunes had moved. A sustained wind pattern had shifted enough sand that something had been exposed, not fully, not dramatically, just a surface, a flat, pale stretch of dressed stone maybe 30 feet across, sitting there in the morning light with the desert around it, still and silent, and the wind having gone somewhere else. They sent a photograph. Emily forwarded it to me without a message, just the image. I looked at it for a long time. The stone was pale and flat and cut with a precision that the open air and the hard light made absolutely unambiguous. The joints were tight. The surface was level. And at one edge, where the sand hadn't fully pulled back yet, you could see the beginning of a wall rising at a clean right angle, dressed on both faces, built to last in a way that had in fact lasted through everything, through the fire and the flood and the sand and the centuries of being told it wasn't there. My grandfather had photographed a corridor 30 years ago and written 2 words on the back. I used to think those words were a warning. Now I think they were something else. I think they were the last thing an honest man could bring himself to say when he was standing between what he knew and what he was allowed to know, and the weight of that position had become more than he could carry alone. Don't ask, wasn't a door being closed? It was a door being left unlocked by someone who understood that the right person asking the right question at the right time changes everything. The desert doesn't forget. It just waits, and it has been waiting for a very long time. Here is what this whole story means to me, and I think it's worth saying plainly. We have built our understanding of human history on the assumption that what survived is a fair representation of what existed. But survival is not random. Documents get redirected, access gets restricted, researchers get reassigned, sites get removed from active lists. None of it requires a single coordinated plan. It only requires enough people at enough decision points choosing the comfortable version of events over the disruptive one. And over enough time, that quiet accumulated choosing reshapes the entire record. What we call history is not the past. It is the past as filtered through every decision ever made about what was worth preserving and what was easier to let go quiet. The Sahara is the largest gap in that record, and the gap is not empty. So here is the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want to know what you think. If a civilization of that scale existed, was connected across an entire continent, built infrastructure we can barely explain even now, and was then erased so thoroughly that the mainstream record treats the whole region as a blank, what does that tell us about how fragile the truth actually is? And more uncomfortably, what else are we walking around confidently describing that is just as incomplete, just as filtered, just as shaped by what someone once decided we didn't need to know? Write your answer below. I mean it. I read every comment, and this is the conversation worth having. If this story made you think, please hit the like button and subscribe. It is the only way this kind of research keeps moving forward, and there is a great deal more of this story still to tell.